Well, it finally happened. Wes Huff has appeared on the Joe Rogan podcast after completely dismantling Billy Carson, who was a previous guest on Joe Rogan's podcast. So today on Pastor Reacts, we are going to be reacting to the key points in the conversation between Wes and Joe that correlate to the Bible and biblical studies and text criticism and all that fun stuff. I will not be making a 3-hour-long video today because that would be crazy. So definitely, if you enjoy this video, go and watch the original video and support Joe Rogan on his podcast. All right, without further ado, let's get into it.
Wes, very nice to meet you.
Joe, pleasure.
So I, like many people, was introduced to you because of the debate that you had with Billy Carson.
Quote unquote.
You know, it's one of those things where it's very unfortunate when people get caught with their pants down. And I'm not an expert in many things, but the things that I am an expert on, you could wake me up at 4 o'clock in the morning and ask me about those things. And I go, oh, yeah, no, this is what it is.
Yeah.
I know. You know, like martial arts or comedy, I could give you an expert version of reality. It seems like he does not have that, and he is a wonderful talker, and it's a lot of fun. I like watching his videos. I love all that ancient history stuff, and even the most ridiculous tinfoil hat aspects of ancient. It's fun.
It's entertainment.
But I know that there's a different, like Andrew Schultz and I had a discussion about this. Like he said when he had Billy on the podcast, he said, we're not going to research anything. We're not going to search anything. We're not going to do anything. We'll just let him talk because it's fun.
Yeah.
Andrew's awesome. But when he was on with you, it was quite apparent that you are an actual expert in the Bible and in many religious texts, and that he didn't necessarily have the facts straight. So what was the fallout of all of that?
Well, it's interesting you say the expert thing, because I literally was asked to do it 24 hours beforehand. So I had like the least amount of preparation going into it, and I was okay with that. Because I'd listened to Billy Carson. Well, and I listened to the stuff he'd said. So I knew enough about the ways that he'd articulated things about the ancient Near East and the Bible and Christianity to know enough that his level is pretty surface. But the fallout was that not only did he not want us to release the conversation, but then he started throwing out cease and desist letters. And then he started, trying to sue people. So, I mean, I was...
Oh, yes, I forgot about this. So after the conversation between Wesley Huff and Billy Carson, what actually happened is Carson, he actually threatened to sue the Mark, the guy that hosted the conversation, who apparently, I think he was friends with Billy Carson, actually. And so he actually threatened to sue Wesley Huff if either of them posted the video. And so that's pretty crazy because Wesley Huff is Canadian, and he filmed, he was recorded from his home in Toronto. And so, like, in order for that to do that, okay, I know there's a lot of talk about Canada being the 51st state, but it hasn't happened yet, which means you can't just sue a Canadian for no reason, right? Like you actually have to go through the Canadian court, through Canadian judges, and the judge would look at this and be like, you guys did like an online conversation and you're embarrassed, and so now you want to sue him for a bunch of money? Like, get out of here. That wouldn't hold up in any court in North America, let alone a court, an international court between the States and Canada. That wouldn't happen. But he literally tried to do this, and then he went on his channel, Billy Carson did, and he did a 3-hour-long live stream in which he actually stated, I don't even care if I win. I just want you to spend a bunch of money in legal fees, which is insane because that opens you up to a countersuit because you just admitted you're just wasting everybody's time and money. But anyway, so that happened. So let's find out what Wes has to say about that crazy situation that happened.
I was never worried because I'm a Canadian, and anybody who's tried to sue internationally knows that.
Good luck.
Yeah, right. Yeah. As far as I understand it, he would have had to file a claim in a Canadian court that would have been reviewed to have legal precedence. That he'd have to prove that he could win.
What was his argument?
Apart from the fact that he was embarrassed that he lost?
Well, yeah, that's not really an argument, right?
Yeah, the cease and desist letter said, I don't want you to use my name or my face in anything going forward, and anything you've used up until this point you need to remove. And I was given 24 hours notice to do this.
But if you're a public figure, he's clearly a public figure. Is that even, can you actually say? No,
you can't do it.
So what was does he have a lawyer that wrote this cease and desist? Is he a lawyer?
No. So he actually, it's interesting because Mark Menard, who was the guy who hosted this interaction, he sent Mark a handwritten one. And then he eventually gave Mark an official one from his lawyer. So I actually was sent one by his lawyer, which I, screenshotted, posted publicly online and said, I'm going to ignore this. But he'd sent Mark, who was the podcast host, as far as I'm aware, numerous cease and desists, and Anton, who was the media manager. He'd sent a number of cease and desists.
It's unfortunate.
It is unfortunate.
When you get caught with your pants down, you're supposed to say, I got caught with my pants down.
Yeah.
That's what you're supposed to do. It's the only, especially if you're public. It's very...
I think that's probably the best way to put it. Joe Rogan is right. He got caught with his pants down. And he didn't fess up to it. Yeah, that's all I have to say about that.
Very clear that you're incorrect.
Well, the irony of this situation is if he just kind of left it, it probably wouldn't have made anywhere close to the splash.
No.
That it's made. And we told him that. We said, hey, right. Barbara Streisand effect is going to happen.
Yeah.
You're a big enough personality that if I make a video and say, hey, I had this conversation.
Okay, so for those of you who were not born before 1995, let me tell you what the Barbara Streisand effect is, okay? So there was a singer named Barbara Streisand, and she was really wealthy, and she was really rich, and she had a really big mansion on beachfront property. So what happened is I think it was some company, they might have been environmentalists, and they were taking photos of the beach. And in the backdrop of the photo, you can see Barbara Streisand's mansion. And so Streisand, she made a big deal about this, a way bigger deal than was necessary. And what happened is that nobody cared, right? Like anybody that would have saw this photo would not have known that was her mansion in the background. And so she demanded that the photo be removed, and then more people started going and more photos started getting taken. And then so she took a moment that was just a nothing moment, and because she complained about it, and because she, being a celebrity, made a big deal about it, it went viral and it became a big deal. And so now this is what is known as the Barbara Streisand effect. Sometimes even if you do something embarrassing, if you just shut up about it, nothing is going to happen, right? But because people try to protect themselves and they get a little bit too dramatic, they turn a nothing sandwich into a viral moment. And that is exactly what happened with Wesley Huff and Billy Carson, right? Billy Carson was pretty famous, right? He was pretty popular. And Wesley Huff was a nothing, right? An absolute nothing. When the day I saw this conversation online between Billy and Wes, Wes Huff had like 20,000 subscribers the day that I saw. At the recording of this video, he is getting close to like 300,000 subscribers in like 3 weeks. And so like the reason why Wesley Huff is on Joe Rogan is because of the Barbara Streisand effect. So, like going forward, maybe keep that in mind, like if you guys ever do anything embarrassing, like maybe if you just shut up about it and it probably nothing will happen.
And part of the whole, like what I was trying to get Billy in that conversation that I had with him to get to the bottom of partly was a question of methodology. Like I think he got frustrated at me at one point because I kept asking, what are the criteria that you're using when you're looking at one source versus another source and coming up with a conclusion? Because in historiography, it's the inference to the best explanation. And so there are different ways that you go about that, different methodologies. And historians very rarely disagree on the data and the evidence. It's the conclusions that you draw from that. Right. But then there are some things that are just out and out false. And
okay, so what Wes is trying to get at here is he's talking about the different types of ways of understanding things, right? Like, for example, there are different worldviews. There are different methods of how you're going to deal with information, right? Like, for example, how are you going to interpret a text? There are both atheist Bible scholars, there are Christian Bible scholars, and there are Jewish Bible scholars, right? And so depending on your worldview, you're going to go to a text, and if you're an atheist, you do not allow yourself to believe in miracles because that doesn't fit your worldview, right? Now, if you are a Jewish person or a Christian and you look at the same text and you read it, you will come to a different conclusion. For example, later on, Wes and Joe, they're going to talk about the resurrection, right? So depending on your worldview, if you read about Jesus being raised from the dead in an ancient text, if you are an atheist, you are going to say something like, well, something happened, but it couldn't be the resurrection. Why? Because as an atheist, you don't believe in miracles, right? But if you're a Christian, you're going to go to the text, you're going to read the text, which says that Jesus was raised from the dead, and you're going to come to the conclusion Jesus was raised from the dead. Why, though? Because you two are reading the same text, right? And so what Wes is getting at is the problem isn't the data, because we both have the same data, but the difference is you could come to a completely wrong interpretation with what you do with the data. And so this is kind of what Wes is getting at, is if you have a poor methodology, if you have a poor understanding of history, if you have a poor understanding of context, if you have a poor understanding of the original languages, you may not come to the correct conclusion. And so this is kind of what Wes was trying to get at with Billy. Billy wasn't even grasping what Wes was even asking him.
So I study paratextual features. We're really going to get nerdy today.
Let's get nerdy.
So you look at the features of the manuscripts, not necessarily the words, but things like the spaces between the words, the development of punctuation, indentation or outdentation. And I look at the margins, and I try to, based on the average size of manuscripts in and around that time, and also the average spacing of words and the margins on the top, bottom, and the side, recreate what the manuscript could have possibly looked like.
Whoa.
Yeah.
So when you say the book of Isaiah is intact, how similar is it to the book of Isaiah that's in the Bible?
So that one is fascinating. So this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but when we discovered the Great Isaiah Scroll, previous to that, the earliest copy of Isaiah that we had was in the Masoretic text, which is in the Middle Ages.
Whoa.
Yeah, so it was literally 1,000 years. We literally pushed back our understanding of Isaiah 1,000 years. And the thing that really shocked scholars, like I said, this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is
So
that
this
it
is the
right
Great
there?
Isaiah Scroll. So if you go to Israel and
Wait,
you go...
is that papyrus?
Okay, so Wesley kind of got in a little bit of trouble for this online in what he just said to Joe Rogan. Okay, so let's talk about this. So I think Cosmic Skeptic did a video on this criticizing what Huff said to Rogan about the Isaiah scroll. Okay, so when, like, you need to understand, Wesley Huff is a scholar that if you were to put the Isaiah scroll up against another one, he's not saying there's not going to be any textual variance. What he means is that you need to understand that 200 years ago, the leading belief among atheist scholars was that the Old Testament didn't exist and that it was made up like thousands of years after the Jews said the scrolls were written down. And the reason is because the oldest manuscripts we had was the Masoretic text, okay? So the Masoretic text was written in the Middle Ages by the Masoretes. And what they were doing is they were editing and transcribing and copying the scrolls that had been handed down to them by their ancestors. But because that was the oldest evidence we had, a lot of the atheist scholars, they were saying, well, for all we know, Judaism isn't even an ancient religion, because the best and oldest manuscripts we have for the Old Testament comes out of the Middle Ages. It doesn't reach to Jesus, let alone to Moses. And so you need to understand that when Wesley Huff, when he says they're word for word identical, he is not saying that there are no variants. A variant is a word that can be misspelled, okay? So if the word Isaiah is misspelled, that is a textual variant, right? But you and I know what it means. Okay, so what he means when Wesley Huff says they're word for word identical, he's saying it has the exact same meaning from the words, right? So if the word "the" is misspelled, or if the word Isaiah has one letter less, but you still know it says Isaiah, that word is still identical. That is what Wesley Huff is saying. I also noticed that, like, some people they're pointing out, like, there are some words that are in the Isaiah there are some words that are in the Masoretic text that aren't in the Isaiah scroll. But but part of that is because, like, the word got scraped off over time, or the scroll decayed, and so, like, that word kind of got rubbed out. But that doesn't change the meaning. We still know what it means, and we still know what it says. So when Huff says they're identical, he means they're identical in meaning. That's what he means. Like, he's speaking from a scholarly point of view, not from a literal point of view, right? And so you need to understand that this was huge because what the Dead Sea Scrolls proved is that the Masoretes did a good job when they copied down the scroll of Isaiah, because it was the same. That is what Huff is getting at. And so like some people will say there's 2,500 different variants between the Dead Sea scroll of Isaiah and the text that we use for our modern day Bibles. Yeah, but there might be 2,500 textual variants, but none of them change the meaning. And that's the point. And so let's not, like, cross blades on something that's silly or ridiculous like this. Because Wesley Huff is not wrong when he says they're identical. He may... Now, is he exaggerating a little bit when he says every single word? maybe, but not really, because at the end of the day, the two scrolls really are the same. Like they have the same meaning, and if there's a one word missing in the sentence, you still know the word's supposed to be there. And so at the end of the day, like this isn't even an issue, but lots of people, they make it their mission to try and destroy someone. But anyway, that's all it is. It's just silliness and not something you really need to take all that seriously.
Yes. No, I think that one is vellum.
What is vellum?
So I should be more specific. So parchment is animal skin. Vellum can be used synonymously with the term parchment. Technically, parchment is like baby animal skin, like calves or lambs. But this is the Great Isaiah Scroll, and you can see like they stitch together the parchment because it's so long.
God, it's so beautiful. The way they wrote back then was so beautiful. I mean, maybe it's because I can't read it, that it's so fat. Maybe if I saw English, I would think that's beautiful too.
Yeah.
Especially script, like cursive. Cursive is very beautiful. But that is so fascinating because obviously coming from a point of ignorance, the letters look so similar. Like so many of, this is the what I always got about cuneiform. When I look at that, I'm like, it's just one particular sort of character that's this way and that way and up and down and...
Oh, cuneiform is wild.
Weird.
It's really, really tricky. And that's the thing when, like, if you're studying ancient languages and you start to study Greek, like, the Greek alphabet is similar enough that you're like, okay, alpha looks like an A, right? Delta looks like a D. So you can figure it out. And so it tricks you because you start off and you're like, oh, this is phobios, fear.
Let me show you what he means. Okay, so this is the Greek alphabet. Okay, so do you see that letter that looks like an A at the top left of the chart? So that is the letter alpha. Alpha literally is the exact same capital A and the exact same small a. And then the letter right beside it is the letter beta, which is the exact same as our letter B. So alpha and beta are the same. And so this here is actually gamma, right beside the beta. And that's the equivalent of the letter G in Greek. And right beside it, you see that thing that looks like a triangle? That's delta. So that's actually the letter D in Greek. And you can see it because right beside it, it kind of gives it away. Like it looks like a little letter D. Like that's the little delta, and the big delta is a triangle, right? And then we go over to epsilon, and it's just a big E. The zeta looks like a Z or a Z if you're Canadian, right? And then so you can kind of tell, right? So just about half of the letters in Greek look just like the English equivalent. So that's kind of what Wesley Huff is getting at. So you can kind of tell, like when you're learning Greek, you can it helps if you know English because you already know half of the Greek alphabet, or basically half the Greek alphabet, right? Because it looks the same as in English and it makes the same sound. And the same thing happened with some of the words, right? Like Wes uses the word phobia as an example, right? The Greek word for phobia in Greek is the word phobios, right? So like if you're a first year Greek student and you start studying Greek, the first week you're kind of like, oh, this is easy. And then by the second or third week, you're calling your professor crying because it is so hard to understand. That's what Wesley is kind of getting at here.
But Hebrew is completely the opposite because the writing system is so different. The learning curve is hard at the beginning, and then you're like, everything is just 3 letters with a suffix added to it. And so it feels like, whereas the opposite is true with Greek. Greek, you're like, I get this. And then when you really go down the rabbit hole, you're like, oh crap, none of the things that I learned about that are supposed to be standard, all of them have exceptions.
Wow.
But cuneiform's a wild one.
Do you know who Rick Strassman is?
No.
He's a scholar, and he did a lot of early work, FDA-approved work on psychedelics. And he spent 16 years teaching himself to read.
Like Joe Rogan, he could not get through a podcast without bringing up psychedelics at least once, right? Like, it's got to happen.
Ancient Hebrew.
Nice.
Yeah, so because he wanted to really understand the Bible from the original source of ancient Hebrew and to understand it in context. Because ancient Hebrew, the way the words are structured, is so different than English, and that something must be lost in translation. So he spent 16 years teaching himself how to read ancient Hebrew. I was like, that is that is such dedication. 16 years.
It's a long time. That seems too long.
Well, you're self-taught. I mean, he's doing it himself.
Yeah, self-teaching. Yeah, I self-taught myself Greek at first, and then when I started learning it formally, I realized how much you miss when you self-teach yourself.
Oh, I'm sure. Well, how many people can teach you ancient Hebrew? How many courses are available?
Oh, you can take it at any graduate college.
Yeah?
Yeah. And when I see people like Billy Carson talk about being able to read Sumerian, I'm like, dude, I read ancient languages, and I can't. I've tried, and I can't make heads or tails of Sumerian. Yeah. So
that's a tell.
Unfortunately, it kind of gives away.
Listen, I like Billy. He was a nice guy. I really enjoyed talking to him. I really do. I think his videos are fun. But I also think truth is important.
I have no problem with him as an individual.
He just needs to course correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, course correct and recognize what you know and what you don't know. And that you're not doing people a service, especially people like myself that aren't educated in this. Like we turn to others who claim to have a vast knowledge of this to help me out. Tell me what's going on. When I sit down and talk to you, tell me what's going on. And if you don't really know, you're fighting over a lot of people, unfortunately, for yourself.
By the way, this is like 95% of all social media, right? Like most of the stuff you see on Facebook, most of the stuff you see on TikTok. TikTok is probably the worst for misinformation because anybody in their parents' basement can just put up a camera and start filming. And in 30 seconds, you can say anything, right? But the problem is most scholars aren't on Facebook, right? Most people that have actually dedicated their lives to understanding this stuff, they're not on TikTok, right? And unfortunately today, TikTok and Facebook are two of the worst places for false claims, for fake news. And so absolutely, and that includes YouTube, by the way, right? And also, just because I said this in my last video, just because your pastor says something from the microphone doesn't mean he's right. Just because somebody has a microphone doesn't mean they're right. Just because someone is popular doesn't mean they're right. I'm not very popular, so I'm probably right. Just kidding. Anyway, let's go on.
I mean, this is part of the reason why you have these long spans of time between like when people live and then the ancient biographies that start to pop up about them, is because most people are just illiterate.
But to imagine how crazy that is, that something in a time where there's no printed press and something that had been passed on for so long as an oral tradition is exact word for word written.
Pretty wild.
You find in a cave in Qumran.
Yeah.
And then the same thing you get in the English translation of the Bible today. That's nuts.
Yeah. I mean, up until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the New Testament manuscripts predated the Old Testament manuscripts by a long shot.
Really?
Yeah. Because the Christians were less discerning in their proliferation of written documents. So the Jews had this whole system where you had to be a trained scribe, and they were very, very careful with the procedures that you went through. Whereas the Christians were like, we want to get this thing out as fast as we can, as often as we can, which had a lot of benefits in that, like, their goal was a proselytization and evangelism, and that worked. But the downside of it was that you get really messy copies. where you have copies all over the place, but human error gets involved with like spelling differences and, you know, additions, deletions, mostly for completely like understandable reasons. But we actually have manuscripts where we know the person copied it and they didn't know how to read it because they make mistakes that you wouldn't make if you knew how to copy. There's this really great example of a guy who copies, I believe it's the genealogy of Matthew, and he's looking at a manuscript that has 2 columns, and he's copying it from left to right, and he's copying it like this, whereas it's like the column you go down and then the next column. So in the genealogy of Jesus, he's got all the wrong people begetting all the wrong people. Oh. And you're like, you wouldn't do this if you knew how to read, because God is in the middle of the genealogy. So like that kind of thing.
That is a real problem.
That is a real problem. But ironically, with the Christian manuscripts, because we have so many, it's actually because of the mistakes that we're able to trace the text back with a high degree of confidence. Because if you have copies that are floating around, you know, North Africa and places like Egypt, and then you have copies in Syria, and you have copies out into Asia and into Europe and the British Isles, when mistakes pop up, they're geographically located. And because you have so many, you can compare and contrast them and figure out, okay, well, this obviously happened here at this time, and you can pinpoint those things. So this is a field called textual criticism.
Okay, so so this is a really good point. So one of the things that Wesley Huff is getting at here is he's about to go into textual criticism. So basically what happened in the early church, because Rome started their persecutions pretty early in the church's history, right? Like Rome killed both Paul and Peter. And so and they're founders, right? Like they're founders of the Christian faith, the original apostles. And so what happens is the Christians, the first texts that became scripture for the Christians were the 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so what happens is the Christians, they start making as many copies as they can, because Rome is arresting them and burning the Gospels. That is what is happening. They're burning their holy books. They're burning scripture. And so basically what's going on is they are just copying them as fast as they can, to make as many copies as they can so that the Romans don't get them all, right? And because their main emphasis is on evangelism, on building the church, and having these copies of the Gospels everywhere, what happens is they start making mistakes. And that's what he starts getting his example of Matthew is about, is the mistakes are clear, and so they're not difficult. But what textual criticism does is this is actually the art, or rather the field of applying textual criticism in order to ascertain what the original text was, right? Because, like, for example, he's saying the mistakes that get made in Jerusalem, they are not going to be the same mistakes that get made in Asia. And so, for example, if you're reading through a text of scripture and it has this really weird reading, like for example, the genealogy is wrong, but you get a text over from Ephesus, and in Ephesus, in that portion of scripture, those mistakes aren't there. Well, you can spot a mistake pretty clearly. And so what Huff is getting at is that in Christianity, we have so many different manuscripts. When we apply textual criticism, it's actually pretty easy to get back to what the original would have said, because you notice these mistakes over here don't match these mistakes over here. And so by seeing where the mistakes are, you can figure out pretty easily what it's supposed to say, because over here, that mistake isn't there. And then so you say, oh, so that's right. They got that stuff right, but they made mistakes there. But over in Asia Minor, they made different mistakes in different areas. And so when you kind of bring them together, you can figure out, oh, this is what the original text said, because you know from this place and this place what it would have looked like without the mistakes, right? And so like there's an entire field called textual criticism, and this is the art of where scholars, they go to ascertain what the original text would have looked like. And you'd be surprised how good they are at this. And so I actually made a video on, if you're interested, on the Dead Sea Scrolls. I did some stuff about textual criticism in the same video. So if you're interested in that stuff, at the end of this video, I will give you a link to my video that I did on the Dead Sea Scrolls, Bible translation, and textual criticism.
Where we do this with all ancient documents. Like the Bible is a more kind of fleshed out field of textual criticism because we have so many manuscripts. But we do it with, Marcus Aurelius. We even do it with Shakespeare with the different copies. Because if you only have one copy, you have to trust that the person who copied that got it right.
Right.
Yeah. Which is the issue that we have for the Beowulf. We only have one copy of Beowulf. And so we don't know what it looked like prior to that. So we just kind of accept that, okay, this is Beowulf. Like there's no way to compare and contrast the tradition of the manuscripts of Beowulf.
Okay, so, and that's a really good point as well, because often online, the Bible, it just gets criticized by atheists, right? There's a pretty famous atheist scholar, his name is Bart Ehrman, and he's gone as far as to say there are 40,000 errors among the manuscripts of the New Testament. And the reality is that's just being facetious. Because one of the things we actually know, that when you put all of the manuscripts together, none of the variants affect a single portion of Christian doctrine. Not one essential doctrine is compromised. In fact, Bart Ehrman, he's actually said in interviews since then that we can actually know what the original reading said, but you don't sell books by saying stuff like that, right? Like you need to be dramatic, and you need to be controversial and that sort of thing. And Bart Ehrman, he's pretty good at that. But to Wes's point, why does everybody question the Bible? Why do people say, "Oh, we have no idea what the Bible really said," but we have one copy of Beowulf? And there's no doubt that that's exactly Beowulf, right? There is like 1,000 years between Homer and the first manuscript we have of the Iliad, and yet nobody denies this is exactly what Homer wrote, right? Nobody questions that type of stuff. Right? And so, but what do we have for the Bible? For the Bible, we have manuscripts. Some of them are within 40 years of the original, right? Like honestly, people that study Greek history, they wish they could have an ounce of what we have with the Bible. But the reality is, and Bart Ehrman has actually said this, many atheist scholars have actually said this, the Bible is the best attested ancient document in all of history.
The crazy thing about Christianity, where you have this Jewish itinerant guy who's walking around first century Roman occupied Judea, he's making some pretty audacious claims to be God himself, and then he predicts his own death and resurrection. And then his disciples they think it's over. Like they're like, he's dead. We're done.
Yeah.
And then they go from 11, scared men, because Judas commits suicide, scared men in an upper room, to completely overhauling the Roman world in only a couple hundred years because of this claim that they say they saw Jesus resurrected. Like there's something different that goes on there, that they're like, this is a miracle, right? Dead people don't usually rise from the dead.
So, what is your personal belief when it comes to the resurrection? What do you think do you have a belief, or do you just try to interpret the text and try to see what is the message?
Well, I think so.
Oh, you guys, this is so exciting. Okay, so for you atheists or non-Christians that are watching, like you need to understand what a moment this is for us, okay? Like literally over the last 10 years, Joe Rogan, he has had people on literally saying Christianity came out of a mushroom religion. Like there were just a bunch of people trying to get high. Like we've had people come on talk about how stupid religion is and about how stupid Christianity is. Literally 9 years ago, Joe Rogan went on like a 20-minute rant about Constantine and about how the scriptures were completely made up and about how Jesus probably wasn't even a real person, right? So now you need to understand, finally, we have a scholar on here that is putting down conspiracy theories. He is putting down all of these fake online myths about our faith. And finally, we're having our say. Like you have no idea how exciting this is for us. Okay, let's see. Wesley Huff, he has an opportunity here. Let's see what he does with it.
As a historian, I do think it is a historical question. You have a guy who objectively lived. He objectively died, and then individuals close to his inner circle claim that they see him not dead.
Right.
Again.
This is a highly unusual activity.
Highly unusual.
Right. So, but it's hard when you're dealing with illiterate populations, you're dealing with thousands of years of time, you're dealing with an oral tradition, and then you have us sitting here talking about it in 2024, trying to figure it at the end of 2024, trying to figure this out. Literally the end.
Yeah.
Last couple of days. It's very difficult for anybody who thinks of themselves as an intelligent person who's secular to even entertain the possibility that someone died and come back to life.
And I get that.
Which he's right about, by the way, right? Like these are real problems and these are legitimate issues that Rogan just brought up, right? And it would be unwise for any Christian to deny any of these things as legitimate issues that need to be worked through and need to be discussed. Let's see what Huff has to say about this.
But we've already talked about the fact that we don't think that the only thing that exists is matter and motion. We as in you and I, right? Like, we believe that there's something else going on in this world that's a little bit crazy.
There's something else.
And that to, I think, exclude that, I think excludes something that you're kind of putting blinders on. For. And you do have, I mean, you're right in terms of all of these ancient conventions and the ways that things were spread around. But the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. And they're written in this period of time where you have groups of individuals who could have fact-checked those things. So
how do you fact-check someone coming back from the dead?
Well,
how many people saw his body, right?
Well, Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once.
400 people saw the crucifixion?
No, saw the resurrected Jesus. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples, and then he appeared to 400 people all at once. I mean, if we read the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Luke and Acts, so same author wrote these both documents, he says that Jesus was walking around teaching them for 40 days after he was resurrected from the dead. And so these are written within a time period when you have people who would have seen Jesus' ministry, who were there, say, at something like the feeding of the 5,000, who could have been able to verify or debunk some of these things that are being said. And you go from a bunch of scared guys who, because Jesus wasn't the only messianic figure who arose and claimed to be the Messiah.
Right.
There were a number of individuals both prior to and after Jesus, but they die and the movement dies with them.
Do you think it's possible that he didn't die? And do you think it's possible that they thought he was dead? Because that does happen. There was actually a case very recently where a guy was about to be harvested for organs. They thought he was dead, and this guy started moving again and came back to life. It's a very, very bizarre case because his family had been told that he was going to be harvested for organs. They were preparing for that. And this guy comes back.
Yeah, I mean, we know a lot about Roman crucifixion. And we know brutal. That, and we know that they did their job well.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, if you look at, say, very skeptical biblical scholars, like non-believing, atheist, agnostic Christian scholars, they will say if we can know anything about Jesus, like they'll cast a doubt on a lot of the things that we read about in the Gospels in terms of the actual historical Jesus of Nazareth. They'll say one thing we can be sure of is that he died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Because
yeah, so this is an important claim. Most scholars, and when I say most scholars, I mean 99.9% of scholars, absolutely agree on three main things, right? Jesus of Nazareth was a real person, number one. Number two, Jesus of Nazareth lived in the first century. Number three, Jesus of Nazareth was crucified and died under the reign of Pontius Pilate as governor in Judea. Any serious scholar agrees on those 3 points. Jesus of Nazareth absolutely died. And a bonus thing that all serious scholars agreed upon, something happened that changed the world. Like literally something happened. Because here's the problem. Like Wes has just pointed out, Jesus was not the only messianic figure. He was not the only man during this time that claimed to be the Messiah and started a messianic movement. There are like 24 people 50 years before Jesus and 50 years after Jesus. They claimed to be the Messiah. They claimed to be descendant from King David. And most of them led revolts against the Romans. And the Romans crucified them. And when they crucified the leader, nobody said, I think he was raised from the dead, right? Nobody would say that because when the death of the founder, because when the founder of the movement died with them, right? You have either two options when your leader dies. You can go out and get a new leader, which was usually a family member. And we need to remember Jesus' brother James was a pretty famous rabbi, right? Like Jesus had brothers, and you could easily go out and get James, or you could go out and get his brother Jude, and they could be the new founder. But no Christian said James is our king. No Christian said that Jude is our Messiah. They all maintained Jesus of Nazareth is the Christ. He is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and he is ruling and reigning, right? The other option you have is to run for your life and never talk about it again, right? What did the disciples do? They talked about it so much that they started getting killed. Like they started dying for their faith. And if you know something is a lie, you're not going to die for it. You might die for something you think is true and you'd be wrong, but if you know it's not true, you are not going to be martyred for that thing. That's just not going to happen. And so the Jesus movement was different because something had to have happened on the third day. And the Christians maintain, we know what happened. It was the resurrection. But let's see if Wes is able to convince Rogan.
Because we have not just multiple attested documents that we refer to as the New Testament, but Roman and Greek and Jewish writers refer to that claim afterwards and talk about the fact that you have this guy, and it's mocked within earliest Christianity. So one of our earliest, in fact, not one of, the earliest depiction of Jesus on the cross is called the Alexamenos Graphido. And it's probably from the end of the 1st century. And it's it depicts an individual with their arms raised in an act of worship, worshiping a man with a donkey's head who's being crucified. Whoa. And right beside it, it says Alexamenos worships his God in Greek. Whoa. And it's
actually, let me see if I can pull this up for you guys, because I think it would probably be helpful if you could actually see it. Okay, so this is the Alexamenos that Wesley Huff is talking about. So you see right at the top here, do you see the donkey head? And then so that's somebody, and so you can see the person is on the cross being crucified, and this is supposed to be Alexamenos right there. And this is and then the Greek words say Alexamenos worships his God. Right? And so this is the earliest depiction of Jesus on the cross, and it's a blasphemous insult is what it's doing. It is insulting Jesus. Now, and you need to understand why this is important, okay? This is important because crucifixion was the most shameful thing that could happen to a person, right? In the ancient world, no one would make up this story, right? Like you need to understand this. Like for years, the argument was that Christianity is made up, and like Constantine got together with a bunch of bishops and they came up with the story for the religion, and the whole thing is made up. Here's the problem with that, you guys. Nobody would make up a story like this. No one would make up a story where God would demean himself in such a way as to be tortured to death by the Romans. Nobody would have believed this story, right? Like there's a reason why in 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul says the gospel is a stumbling block for the Jews and it is foolishness to the Gentiles. And he says that because this story would never be made up by somebody, right? If you're going to make up a religion, you're going to make up a religion about a God of power that's strong and almighty, and basically you're going to make up Zeus. That's basically what you're going to do. You're going to make up a God that is so strong and powerful, and he's just going to wipe out all his enemies, and you're going to be forced to bow to him for his sheer awesomeness, right? That would be a made-up religion. Right? What is the faith of the Christians? The faith of the Christians is Jesus' meekness. It's not his strength. It's not through violence that he conquers his human enemies. You know how he conquers his human enemies? By gentleness, kindness, and love. Nobody would tell this story unless it was true. That is what Wesley Huff is trying to get at here, right? This is the first depiction of Jesus, and it is depicting him as an insult because no Greek or Jew would make up this story. And that is the point of the Alexamenos depiction.
Mocking, right? Because crucifixion was for the lowest of the low. It was for like slaves. In fact, if you were a Roman citizen, you were banned from being crucified.
Who was it that got crucified upside down?
Peter.
Why? Was it because like regular crucifixion wasn't good enough for him? Or what was it? He didn't deserve it because Christ had gone through it?
Well, so the story is that they say, we're going to crucify you. And he says, it's like too big of an honor to die like my Lord. And they say, well, we can fix that.
Oh, Jesus. Shut your mouth, buddy.
Listen, the Romans were pretty brutal.
Oh, yeah.
But this is why we know, like it's interesting. We know a lot about crucifixion, but crucifixion was seen as so disgusting. I believe it was Cicero who said that like the word crucifixion shouldn't even be on a Roman man's lips. I mean, the word excruciating,
right.
X is off of in Latin, and cruce, off the cross. So that's where we get that word, is because this was designed to humiliate, and it was designed to be as painful as possible. There was actually a really good article done by JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, which was done by a number of, I think it was in the 70s or the early 80s. It was done by a group of biblical scholars and then medical professionals. And so they looked at the conventions of what we do know about Roman crucifixion, and then they looked at the descriptions in the gospel to try to figure out, okay, if we could diagnose how Jesus died, how would he have died? And so they basically came up with this idea that he probably asphyxiated to death. You kind of drown in your own blood. But the chances of Jesus surviving the crucifixion, I think, are narrow to none. And the chance of him appearing 3 days later completely fine. I mean, if the first thing you do, if you survive a crucifixion and then you go and you find your disciples, the first thing you say is not, peace be with you. It's get me to a hospital, right?
Did they have them back then?
No, not really.
Also, are we entirely certain of their measurement of days?
So this is an interesting question because of the differences between when the Gospel of John says Jesus died compared to the Synoptics, because John appears to be using the Roman convention of counting time, and the other Gospels, when they describe the timing, appear to be using the Jewish ones. And actually, if you correlate between the two, they match up pretty well. So the thing is, with Jews, any part of a day was considered a day. So 3 days and
Okay, so what Huff is getting at here is that a critique that the Gospels have often received from people is that it appears that in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus dies on Friday. And if you read John, the way it reads, it appears as if Jesus dies on Thursday. And so one of the critiques is that, well, the Bible can't be inerrant because both of these cannot be true. What Wesley Huff is getting at is, well, actually, it could be true. And both of those be true because Jews measured days in a different way than the Romans did, right? Because the Romans measured days the way you and I do, right? Our day begins in the morning, right? Morning begins at 12:01. And the day ends at 11:59, right? So you have morning and then you have evening, right? That's a 24-hour day period. The problem is the Jews did not measure time the way you and I do. And you can actually see this in the book of Genesis, because when God creates the days, at the end of the day, it always says it was evening and then morning the first day. So the Jews measured time opposite, right? Their days actually began when the sun set in the evening. That was the beginning of the day, right? And that's actually why their Sabbath does not start and end Saturday morning and Saturday at midnight. Their Sabbath begins at sundown on Friday, and it ends at sundown on Saturday, right? And so what Huff is saying, it appears as though Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that they are measuring time, or they're measuring days in the Jewish way, probably because they're writing to Jewish people, right? John, however, he's the last living apostle, and he's writing to mostly Gentile believers who measure days in a non-Jewish way. And so it looks like when you take this into account, actually the two can be the same time.
3 nights becomes almost an idiom for any part of that day is the day. So if Jesus, and because they count evening and morning, evening to morning is the day, it's very possible that it wasn't like how we would think of 3 24-hour days, especially if he dies on Friday and wakes up on Sunday.
So that would actually make it less time than more time.
Yeah.
So it's not like he had recovery time.
Oh, no, he didn't have recovery
That's
time.
what I'm saying. That's what I'm kind of getting. It's not like it was 3 days. It was actually 3 months.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So,
no, not like that.
Then 400 people saw him afterwards.
That's the claim that Paul makes.
Paul makes it.
Yeah.
And how many different people have some sort of a recollection or a writing or something that's attributed to them of being witness to his resurrection?
Well, you have Peter, Paul, Jude, James, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The thing with Matthew, Mark, and Luke is that Matthew and John are attributed to direct disciples of Jesus. Luke and Mark are not. So they are not eyewitnesses within the Jesus community. In fact, Luke prefaces his gospel by saying that. He's right up front about this. He's like, hey, I'm not an eyewitness. Don't confuse me with an eyewitness. But he actually uses conventional writing. What's the term I'm looking for? He uses writing conventions of the day that would fit within regular biography that was written within the Roman world. So you have a guy named Quintilian who is basically, I mentioned him before with the he's teaching people how to write, and he says that if you're going to write biography, you need to be interviewing eyewitnesses, and you can't be too far away from the event to be able to.
Yeah, so this is important too. So the Gospels actually do have a specific genre, and according to like several historians, will actually say like the Gospels are biographies. That is what they are. And in the ancient world, there was only two types of people that you would write biographies about. You would write biographies about kings, and you would write biographies about gods, right? Now, interestingly, Jesus just happens to be both. He's both a god and he's also a king. Now, another interesting thing that I think Wesley is about to talk about is the fact that Jesus has 4 biographies, and I believe it's Tiberius also has 4 biographies. And so we need to ask the question, who would sink this kind of money into biographies for Jesus? Because you need to understand, you guys, biographies costed thousands of dollars to write, right? Because you need to understand, you need to hire scribes, and you need to kill a bunch of animals in order to have the leather to write on, right? So like books in the ancient world, you think books are expensive today. In the ancient world, it would cost thousands of dollars for one gospel to be written. Just one copy, it would cost thousands of dollars. So now we're talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Like, there's a reason why people only wrote these type of things about kings and gods, because this was a big deal. So now, one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves, why is it that people would sink so much money into not only creating these gospels, but into recreating them and recreating them and recreating them throughout Roman opposition?
How does Constantine fit into this? Like, what is Constantine's education in Christianity?
Yeah, so Constantine is a pagan up until a point in time when he converts. So,
who educates him?
Good question. I don't know in terms of his education. I know he does have some like crossover with some prominent Christians later on. He's a sun worshiper, but right before Constantine, you had a guy named Diocletian, who was the emperor, who basically had the goal of wiping out Christianity entirely. And so the worst point of persecution was under the Diocletian rule. He actually made it so that if you had to go into like the equivalent of your town hall, and you had to take a pinch of incense and offer it onto the altar of Caesar, him, right, the king, and say, Caesare Curios, Caesar is Lord. And part of this was that they knew that Christians say, Jesus Curios, Jesus is Lord. And Christians wouldn't do that. So here's how you outed them. And if you didn't do this, so if you did do it, you were given this piece of paper. It's called a libellus. And a libellus allowed you to buy and sell. If you didn't do it, you didn't get a libellus, which meant that you were not allowed to buy and sell. Wow. And so you have this incredible era of persecution where Christians are being like killed, and Christian literature in particular is being destroyed because they're hunting it out. So Constantine comes after this, and he knows that this is bad for Roman society. And so him and Licinius get together. They're both ruling the Roman Empire at the time. And in 313, they put out this edict of tolerance, which includes Christianity. So it's called the Edict of Milan, and it decriminalizes Christianity. So it's no longer illegal to be a Christian.
What was their motivation?
I think they just felt like in order to establish peace within the empire, you need to make sure that people aren't fearing you constantly to that degree. And so it wasn't just Christianity that benefited from the Edict of Milan. A number of religious minority groups were benefited from this particular event. But this happens between 313 and 325. Constantine converts. And so
yeah, so kind of the backstory for Constantine. So I think the previous emperor was Constantine's father. I can't remember off the top of my head though. But anyway, the worst Christian persecution broke out right before Constantine ascended to the throne. And so we actually know from some ancient documents that Constantine, he would call the Council of Nicaea in, I believe it was 325. He would legalize Christianity in 313 with the Edict of Milan, which is what Wes is about to get at. When Constantine called the bishops to come to a meeting at Nicaea, I'm pretty sure there was like less than 400 bishops that actually attended. And the Bishop of Rome didn't attend himself. He actually sent delegates in his place. And we actually know from some of these ancient documents, some of the bishops that show up to this meeting, they are maimed, and some of them are blinded. Some of them are missing limbs, hands, and arms because they were tortured almost to death by the previous government, right? By the previous emperor of Rome. Tortured them almost to death, but they refused to recant of their faith. And so you can imagine when Constantine shows up, the Christians are not going to trust him, right? And so what do you do if you're an emperor and you actually convert to the religion that the Roman government before you was literally trying to destroy? That's what we're about to find out here.
He becomes friendly to Christians. He also he commissions books of the Bible to be written. And so this is where we first get our understanding. Like when we think of a Bible, we think of it as like in a single bound volume. Like because we have the 66 books of the Bible, and it has a nice cover on the page or on the front. But in the ancient world, those existed independently. So like P52, like that would be a separate copy of the Gospel of John. And that's what it would have been understood as scripture. Well, Constantine, as like a peace offering, commissions all of these documents to be brought together and published in one book. Oh, and so we actually have what we think are some of these documents. So when I was talking with Billy Carson, he brought up the Sinai Bible, Codex Sinaiticus. Codex Sinaiticus is probably one of these documents that Constantine commissioned, because it's one of our earliest examples of a cover-to-cover, Genesis to Revelation copy of the Bible. And it comes from the 4th century. And based on both its dating and based on the fact that this would have been incredibly expensive to make, I don't know, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars today. So the reason why we're pretty sure that documents like Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, potentially even Codex Alexandrinus or Codex Washingtonianus are documents that could have been part of this commissioning is just because they're such giant projects. In, very few people would have had the ability to produce something like this other than an emperor. And so we actually have some of these documents that survive today.
Yeah, okay. So how does an emperor make himself seem trustworthy to the Christians? Well, what the emperor does is the emperor funds the creation of Bibles. And so to Wes's point, in the ancient world, Bibles didn't exist the way we have them, right? Like we have 66 books in between two covers, right? All together. So our Bibles aren't actually books. Our Bibles are actually a library of 66 books all bound together in one book, right? So in the ancient world, that's not how it worked. You would have 66 different scrolls, probably is what you would have. And so they would not be bound together. They would be separate documents. And so some churches would have the Gospel of John. Other churches would have the Gospel of Luke. One church would have the book of Acts. Another might have some of Paul's epistles. So what they would do is they would make copies and they would send them to each other, right? And so what Constantine did is he commissioned the creation of these Bibles, and he just gave it to these churches as a gift, basically as a peace offering from the Roman Empire. And so we actually think, historians actually believe that Codex Sinaiticus, which is the Bible that Wes was actually kind of debating back and forth with Billy Carson, we actually believe that is one of the Bibles that Constantine made for the Christians in the 4th century for the early church. Like this is incredible.
So, in all of this, what do you think of Jesus? Like in terms of your own journeying and trying to find answers to ultimate questions. What do you think of the historical person of Jesus?
Well, finally, you guys, we're at the, as I'm filming this, we're at the 3 hour and 6 minute mark of a 3 hour and 15 minute podcast. And just now, Wes has finally asked him the question we've all been wanting him to ask him this entire time. Finally, we're about to get something. All right. Now, is Rogan going to give an actual answer, or is he going to kind of stumble his way in and bring something that doesn't have anything to do with the question? Because he's done this in this, right? I don't know if this is going to make the cut or not, but Rogan, he brought up dark matter twice. And both times, just almost randomly, had nothing to do, completely nothing to do with the actual conversation. Let's see where Joe Rogan is at. What does he think about Jesus? Let's find out.
It certainly seems like there's a lot of people that believe that there was this very exceptional human being that existed. So the question is, what does that mean? Does it mean he was the Son of God? Does it mean he was just some completely unique human being that had this vision of humanity and this way of educating people and spreading this ideology that would ultimately change the way human beings interact with each other forever? So what is he the Son of God? Well, are we all? That's another question, right? Do we all have that inside of us? Do we all have that ability to change everything around us inside of us? Do we all have that unique...
Are we all gods? No. Are we all the Son of God? No. Are we all God's children?
Connection to the divine And is he a representation of the best version of that, or was he an actual person that was the Son of God? And is it important?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, what?
Yes, it's important. It is important, right? Like, okay, let's go to C.S. Lewis, right? C.S. Lewis gave kind of the litmus test, right? Jesus is either liar, madman, or savior. Right? Jesus either knew what he's saying was wrong, which makes him a liar, which would make him the most successful liar of all time, by the way, was an uneducated Jewish poor man living in the Middle East. Did he start the largest faith religion and end slavery and create entire civilizations? Did a uneducated Jewish liar accomplish all that? Probably not. Was Jesus a lunatic? Some people would say yes, but if he's a lunatic, he's not the Son of God. If he's not crazy, if he's not a liar, that would mean, logically, he was telling the truth. And if he was telling the truth, and he actually was raised from the dead on the third day, that means the gospel is real. That means the afterlife is real. That means heaven is real. That means hell is real. And that means, brothers and sisters, you have a decision to make. If Jesus is the Son of God, it matters. Because partially it means that your eternity has been placed in your hands. And not only that, it means you have purpose. You were born for such a time as this. There's a reason, right? If biological evolution is not the reason you're here, but if you're here because God himself came down to die for you, that means you have purpose. That means you have a reason for being here, and that you have been tasked with leaving this world a better place than when you found it. Is Jesus the Son of God? Does it matter? It matters. It matters. For the Christian, it matters because you could be serving a liar or a lunatic on false pretenses. If you're not a Christian, it matters because eternity is in front of you. And you have been placed here with a purpose to better the world because you are created in the image of God and you are intended to image him into the world as a redeemed, forgiven image bearer. It matters.
What does it mean? It's just the fact that it's a question to ponder is a miracle in itself, in a way. Just the fact that there's this concept of this person that died for our sins, as the Son of God, but you have to you have to believe in a bunch of stuff to go that way. Like, just the concept of that is interesting to people, because what it can do to people is offer them a very unique way to change the way they feel about the world itself. And if you do follow that, I know a lot of Christians that are hardcore Christians that are some of the nicest people you'll ever meet in your life. So it does work. Right? Like, if you do live like a Christian and you do follow the principles of Christ, you will have a richer, more love-filled life. So it is true, right?
Wow. Joe Rogan says it's true. According to Joe Rogan, Christianity works. According to Joe Rogan, you will have a richer life if you become a Christian, if you become a child of the new covenant, and you do what Jesus says when he says, go into all nations and teach them to obey everything I have commanded them. Joe Rogan says, if you follow Jesus, you will have a richer life. This is pretty amazing.
I mean, guys that you're friends with, right? Like the Jordan Petersons and the Douglas Murrays of the world, or, you know, the Tom Hollands, not the Spider-Man actor, the historian, who talk about this stuff. I think I really like the way that Jordan Peterson articulates it, but I think he misses the forest for the trees.
How so?
In that he sees Jesus as an archetype. And I don't think actually even Jesus gives you the opportunity to see him as the archetype. Because I have this love-hate relationship with all of Peterson's stuff, because he seems to get so much right where he walks up to the line, but he doesn't want to cross over.
And is the crossover, you think, connected to a life in academia? Or
no.
What do you think it is?
I wonder, and I'd love to talk to him about this, like how do you remedy this issue that, because he seems to think that the concept of Jesus as an example is more important than the actual flesh and blood first century itinerant Jewish preacher who was crucified and rose from the dead physically, which is the claim of the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament. That's an example for us to look on and live by. But I actually think that Jesus condemns moralism. And ultimately what I see Peterson doing is looking at Jesus as a moral example. And if Jesus is nothing but a moral example, then you can save yourself and you don't actually need a savior. And so I think actually Jesus would have critiqued that, because Jesus was very against moralism.
And how do you define Jesus being against moralism? Like, what do you mean by that exactly?
Well, Jesus looks at the religiosity of his day with like particular groups like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who are these other groups of Jews during his day. So we talked about the Essenes, who actually aren't mentioned in the Bible, but there are other groups like the Pharisees, who are like lay scholars, and the Sadducees, who are professional priest scholars. And he's constantly critiquing the fact that they have this hypocritical religiosity to them, where they're doing things like tithing their mint leaves, like to make sure that they get all of... This is where we get the idea of the letter of the law versus the intention of the law. Like, Jesus critiques them for that, because he says, you're trying to do everything right and you're missing the point. So one of the things he says is like, if your donkey falls in a ravine on the Sabbath, do you pull it out? Or is that work? Like, what's the point of the Sabbath? Is it to not do any work? Like, is it to make sure that you're not working too hard because you might be breaking the Sabbath? Or like, what is the point? He says, like, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And that there's this intention. This is the whole Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, is he keeps saying, you have heard it said, but I say, and he refers to the Mosaic law. And it looks like he's critiquing the Mosaic law, but he's not actually. He's getting back to the intention of the law. So when he says, you have heard it said, do not commit murder, but I say to you, anybody who harbors a hate for their brother in their heart has already committed murder. And what he's getting to is like, what's the intention? What's the meaning of the law that God gives to you? Because the law is like a mirror. It shows you how dirty you are. But his critique is, he's like, you guys are trying to clean yourself with a mirror. That's stupid. It's just going to, if anything, it's going to make you more messy. Like, get in the shower. The law is not what cleans you. The law is what reveals that you're dirty. And so in that sense, I think, if Jesus is a moral example, it actually misses what I think Jesus actually said about what his purpose was, in that you can't do enough to actually live up to the standard that God holds you to. And so if you keep striving, you're actually going to wear yourself out and be exhausted.
Like atheists.
I didn't say you did, Joe.
A lot of them go crazy. They go crazy when they get older.
Yeah.
Listen, Wes, this is such an awesome conversation, and I'm sad that it went down the way it went down with you and Billy, but the good thing out of it is that a lot of people became aware of your work, and it's such exhaustive work. It's really amazing what you've done. Thank you so much for these gifts. We will find a great place for them on the wall here. And thanks and let's do it again. And I would love to do it with you and someone who disagrees too. I think it would be a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think it would be really cool.
This has been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Okay, so my review of Wesley Huff on the Joe Rogan Experience. How did he do? Basically, at the end of the day, you guys, this was a win for Christians everywhere. This was incredible. What has been done? Did Wesley Huff share the gospel with Joe Rogan? I have to go with no on this one. I do not think that he shared the gospel with Joe Rogan, nor do I think that was his goal. There are 3 criteria to sharing the gospel. First of all, the gospel is the good news that God has become king. He has taken his world back, and he has done it through the incarnation, the crucifixion, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, did Wesley Huff give a gospel presentation? No, he did not. But he did present core tenets of the gospel. What did he do in regards to this? He talked to him about the crucifixion. He gave a pretty strong argument that Jesus was absolutely crucified. First of all, Wes argued Jesus was a real person, and scholarship is behind that. Number 2, Jesus died under the order of Pontius Pilate. These are core gospel tenets, and he gave a fairly good argument for the resurrection of Jesus, and he went pretty deep into that. Did he talk about sin? Did he talk about repentance? Not so much. But I don't think this was his goal. So why is this a win? Joe Rogan has been platforming so many of these anti-Christian people. I mean, talking about mushroom cults and talking about how the New Testament was made up at Nicaea by a bunch of bishops, and talking and also propagating a lot of online myths about Emperor Constantine. And today, like, all of those things were deplatformed, which is a win. Like, this is an absolute win for the church. And not only that, they spent like almost 3 hours talking about how awesome the Bible is, and talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls and archaeology and all of these reasons for believing and having faith in Jesus of Nazareth. And so, did he present the gospel? I don't think so. I don't think he brought Rogan to his knees and said that he needs to repent of his sins or anything like that. Did he give core tenets of the gospel? Yeah, he absolutely did that. Did he undo a lot of damage that has been done on Joe Rogan's podcast? 100%. And not only that, but Joe Rogan has agreed that Jesus is the way. He's agreed that Christianity works, and millions of people are going to see this. And who knows what God is going to do through this. And so, my opinion, this was an absolute win. I'm so glad that Wesley Huff had this conversation with Joe Rogan, and I really hope that through this, people, including Joe Rogan, I really hope people are going to come to faith and see that there's a better way to live. Thank you so much for watching, you guys, and we'll catch you guys in the next video.